global democracy lists produced by Freedom House and others. Perhaps that's because they think of Prime Minister Modi as a Hindu nationalist, when I think he's better called an Indian patriot who necessarily takes Hinduism seriously as by far the country's biggest creed. Sadly, faith in God and love of country are pretty rare in Western think tanks, which is why they find India's democracy easier to caricature than to understand. As Prime Minister a decade back, I used to describe India as, quote, the world's emerging democratic superpower. Under Modi, India is no longer a bystander, but increasingly a force in the world as one of the two democratic superpowers. And I'm confident that if there is to be a leader of the free world 50 or 100 years hence, it's as likely to be the Indian Prime Minister as the United States President. India has always been the superpower of the subcontinent. It's never been the aggressor in its wars and tensions, which it's always tried to resolve quickly, fairly, and in ways that allow others to be the best they can. And now, global leadership is beckoning. For a long time, India was a leader of the non-aligned movement, trying to stay aloof from big global struggles. Now, India is a leader of the global south, and as such speaks up for poorer countries to get the fair go they deserve, for all to have the respect and the national independence that India won for itself against the superpower of the day that was slow to acknowledge India's right to be free. To that end, India has now helped to form a new partnership for freedom and development. Unlike NATO, the Quad is not American-led. Indeed, it would not exist but for Shinzo Abe's foresight and determination, and for Narendra Modi's perception and magnanimity. Unlike NATO, the Quad is not a military alliance. Unlike NATO, it lacks formal structures. It's actually a bit like the Five Eyes, a largely informal network based on shared values, common interests and high ideals that's nonetheless helped to keep the peace for 7 decades. As Foreign Minister Jaishankar said on the weekend, the Quad is, quote, here to stay, here to grow, and here to contribute. And if that works out, with annual leaders' summits and scheduled officials' meetings, it certainly could be the most important strategic initiative since NATO. Even though it's not against anyone, it's for the rights of all to be free and aims to help all to be better off in a world of peace, national freedom and international cooperation to tackle global problems like underdevelopment, infrastructure poverty and environmental degradation. But that does mean standing strong against those who would breach the peace. The militarist, Islamist and communist dictatorships that think they have a right to impose their systems on others. For the Australian government recently to readily permit entry into Australia of people from the United Kingdom and Canada who were known to be deeply subversive agitators, if you like, coming to Australia not for tourism, which we welcome, but for politics, which frankly we would rather not have amongst people claiming to be tourists. So I think a government such as Australia's and the Friends of India more generally need to be careful about allowing things to happen in their countries which make it needlessly difficult for the Indian government here at home. That said, obviously it is important for the Indian government here at home to be decent, respectful, to appreciate that in a democracy there will be dissent, that people are entitled to argue for a better chance and a fairer go for different parts of the country and so on. But it's one thing to say that the central government might not have been as sympathetic as it should have been to places X or Y. It's another thing to want to create violence and indeed secessionism inside the country.
Right. Now, I want to ask you a personal question, Mr. Abbott. You've known our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, rather intimately over the last 10 years, and you have described him as a transformative leader. So when you've been a Prime Minister yourself, you're a global statesman. So what do you think makes him a transformative leader? How is he different from other global leaders that you interact with?
Well, there's probably three things, I suppose, about Prime Minister Modi. One, extremely unusual. One, unusual in an Indian context. And one, I would say, necessary for any effective leadership. The extremely unusual thing about Prime Minister Modi is that as a young man, he was sufficiently spiritually minded to spend at least a year as a virtual monk in the Himalayas. Now, as someone who spent 3 years in a seminary myself, before realising that I was a square peg in a round hole, I appreciate someone who gets that the world is not just the here and now. It's not just all about money and materialism. And I think that adds a dimension to Prime Minister Modi which is rare and that people can sense. And I think the inspirational quality that he brings ties back to that. The other thing about Prime Minister Modi is that he is in no sense an establishment figure. He